Hello and welcome back to Infamous Indie. I'm your host, That Dead Girl, and if this is your first time joining me, basically what I do here is I sit down with you all and I share with you a true crime story from my home state of Indiana. So, if you've been tuning in, you know that the past couple of episodes we've been kind of discussing the Sylvia Likens story. So, I did just want to say that I definitely realize the things that we've been discussing with this case have been very graphic. I didn't choose to do this story for some sort of gore or wow factor. I just feel like I don't want to spare anyone the details. For me, I just really feel that Sylvia Likens and her story should never be forgotten. And yes, it just so happens that this story is very unpleasant. The things that Sylvia Likens has gone through up until this point are absolutely horrific. And with that being said, brace yourselves because sadly, the worst is yet to come. So, to anyone watching out there that may be disturbed by this type of subject matter, now would be the time to turn off this episode and go watch something else. So, in the last video, I believe we kind of left off with the introduction of a young man named Ricky Hobbs. Now, by all accounts, Ricky Hobbs was just a typical, normal 14-year-old boy. Ricky was an honor student from a middle class family, and up to this point, he had had no legal troubles whatsoever. Never been in trouble with the law, never really even been in trouble at school. Unfortunately, that would all begin to change once Ricky Hobbs started hanging out at the Baniszewski residence. Now, it's said that Ricky Hobbs was particularly fond of Gertrude Baniszewski, and at this point in the story, he had actually kind of become sort of a personal assistant to Gertrude, especially when it came to Sylvia. And it said that basically Ricky was like Gertrude's little henchman. He would just blindly follow whatever she told him to do. Many speculated that Ricky Hobbs was Gertrude's lover, actually, and basically a lot of people thought that Gertrude had seduced Ricky and kind of brainwashed him into doing all these terrible things for her. Which, does make sense because, as we know, Gertrude does tend to like them a little bit on the young side. And so at this point in the story, Sylvia is actually enduring abuse from all sides. You have Gertrude, you have her children, you have Ricky Hobbs, Stephanie's boyfriend, Coy Hubbard. All of these people are now torturing Sylvia on a daily basis. But the abuse really wasn't just exclusive to the people that lived within the house. Gertrude's children had actually decided to turn Sylvia's suffering into some sort of sick money-making opportunity. They began charging other neighborhood children a nickel to simply come inside and gawk at Sylvia's naked body. Some would even pay only a nickel, mind you, to push her down the stairs of the basement. And as I mentioned in the last video, the basement is now Sylvia's prison. In fact, Sylvia was only brought out of the basement to be bathed or put on display. Sylvia was kept constantly naked, and she was actually very rarely ever fed. And when Sylvia was allowed to eat, it was often in some sort of bizarre fashion, such as being forced to try and eat a bowl of soup with only her fingers. And I did mention in the last video, at this point in time, Sylvia has actually become incontinent. So Gertrude and her son John Jr. would actually have certain days where they would come down and make Sylvia clean the basement. And basically what that meant was she was being made to consume her own fecal matter. They had also given Sylvia some sort of bucket or container to collect her urine. And when it was full, John Jr. and Gertrude Baniszewski would actually force Sylvia to empty this bucket of urine by consuming it. Now, before we get too deep into talking about the details leading up to Sylvia's actual death, I did want to talk about the few times where the girls actually tried to get help or other people from the outside had tried to intervene. So now we're at the height of Sylvia's abuse sometime in October, and Jenny Likens actually manages to sneak a letter to their older sister, Diana Likens. And if you recall, we did talk a little bit about Diana in the last video, or maybe it was the first video. But anyway, during this time, Diana is actually married and has, a family of her own. So basically, in this letter, Jenny details all of the horrific things that have been happening to her and Sylvia since they've been staying at the Baniszewski house. And at the end of the letter, she instructed her sister Diana to immediately get help, call police, and to come and rescue her and Sylvia. And sadly, Diana did not take this letter to heart. She definitely did not take it seriously at all. She basically chalked it up to Jenny being upset for possibly being punished for something she had done wrong, and that Jenny was making up stories and excuses to try and come and live with her. Which I don't really understand why that would be a problem. Just gonna go out on a limb and say if my sister had written me a letter like that and I was the older sister, I definitely would have been concerned and I would have done something. And as it turns out, one of the neighborhood children, Judy Duke, who, if you recall, was forced to fight Sylvia over lies that had been made up by Gertrude, she would actually go on to tell her mother that she had witnessed this treatment of Sylvia. She actually goes on to tell her mother, look, I witnessed several people in that house hitting Sylvia and kicking her while she's lying on the ground. And unfortunately, Judy Duke's mother didn't seem very concerned and would actually just respond by saying, well, sweetie, that's what happens when people are being punished. And shortly after this incident, the family's pastor, Roy Julian, had actually set up a program where he made home visits, kind of basically to try and connect more with his parishioners. So he goes to the Baniszewski house and he and Gertrude sit down and have coffee. So during this meeting with the pastor, Gertrude actually breaks down in this crazy ass story. Basically, she tells the pastor what a burden Sylvia has been on her and her family. And she started the same old song and dance about Sylvia being a prostitute and servicing married men in exchange for money. And every time I have to mention her calling Sylvia a prostitute or saying that she's, engaging with these married men, I just get so angry because in reality, her own daughter, Paula Baniszewski, is right now during this time actually pregnant with the child of a married man. Like, what the fuck? Why are you projecting your own personal shit onto this innocent girl? But anyway, Gertrude goes on to tell this pastor that Sylvia is so unclean and she really just needs to pray for her sins, and, that her daughter is just so virtuous when literally her daughter is very clearly pregnant. Gertrude insisted that young Paula was a virgin and pure, and that Sylvia, all this time, had been trying to pass off her misdeeds onto pure Paula. Whatever. So after hearing all of this, the pastor gets down on his hands and knees with Gertrude, and they begin to pray for Sylvia's salvation. Now you would think this person, this pastor or whatever, would want to see the person he was supposedly praying for, maybe even speak to her to try to get her side of the story, but unfortunately for Sylvia, this pastor didn't do any of those things. So a little bit of time passes, and Diana just has a gut feeling, so she actually decides to just drop by the Baniszewski residence unannounced. She mainly just wanted to check in with her sisters just to make sure, that they're okay. And you could imagine Diana's surprise when she arrived at the Baniszewski house and Gertrude was refusing to let her inside. Gertrude then proceeded to make up an elaborate lie, as Gertrude does, and she tells Diana that Lester Likens had given her strict instructions not to allow Diana to see Sylvia or Jenny under any circumstances. When Diana questioned this, Gertrude then threatened to call the police on her for trespassing, so Diana actually ends up leaving. This entire situation was beginning to finally click with Diana, and it was making her feel very uneasy and just something wasn't right. So the very next day, Diana actually decided to kind of hide out in some nearby bushes to kind of wait around to see if she could see Sylvia or Jenny and maybe have a chance to speak with one of them. So finally, Diana spots Jenny and she walks over to her and, she's like, "Hi, how you doing?" Basically, she just attempts to speak to Jenny. And Jenny responds by saying, "I am not allowed to talk to you," and she just runs away. So obviously, this was very alarming to Diana, who is finally starting to get it and see what's kind of going on here. So she actually calls Child Protective Services and reports Gertrude Baniszewski. So the social worker comes to the Baniszewski house, and Gertrude goes on to tell her that she had actually kicked Sylvia out a couple weeks prior to that because Sylvia was, quote, unclean and, of course, a prostitute. She lied and told the social worker that Sylvia had since run away and no one had seen or heard from her in weeks. And during this visit from the social worker, Gertrude actually got Jenny alone just long enough to threaten her and tell her to go along with her story or she was going to end up tied up in the basement right along with Sylvia. So, of course, when the social worker finally had the opportunity to speak to Jenny, she corroborated Gertrude's entire story and said that, indeed, Sylvia had run away. The social worker then filed a report stating that no more calls needed to be made to the Baniszewski house. And this just really, really confused me because from what it sounds to me that she obviously did not go inside this woman's house. Because had she had gone inside this house, she would have seen that these people were living in squalor. She would have seen there weren't enough bedrooms or beds for all these children. She would have seen that there was no food in the home and not even a stove to cook on. Like, how could you walk into that type of environment and tell me that nothing there raises an eyebrow? And to me, that's the most heartbreaking part of this story is just as we've seen time and time again, people are just failing Sylvia Likens. Child Services failed Sylvia. Her sister failed her. Her own family failed her. The Baniszewski family failed her. The neighborhood children failed her. And their neighbors, the Vermillion family, failed her as well. Like, so many people had the opportunity to stop these terrible things that were happening to Sylvia, and no one really intervened or did anything to help save her. And that just really pisses me off. Like, this whole story, like I said, has been really hard to get through, but just the fact that no one had any regard for Sylvia or her life. Like, they just completely, like I said, disregarded her. And why is that? Why was it so easy to just inflict such pain on this poor girl and not even blink an eye? On October 20th, Gertrude would actually end up calling the police to her own home in regards to an incident that had gone on between her children and a man named Robert Bruce Hanlon. You see, Robert had claimed that Gertrude's children had broken into his basement and stolen a bunch of electronics. And he basically just showed up at her house, stark raving mad, demanding that all of these items be returned. And go figure, the next door neighbor, Phyllis Vermillion, would actually witness this entire incident, and she would even speak to police on this young man's behalf. So I'm kind of guessing that this spooked Gertrude just a little bit. Because on October 21st, Gertrude would demand that her daughter Stephanie, her boyfriend Coy Hubbard, and Ricky Hobbs bring Sylvia upstairs from the basement and put her in a bed upstairs. Gertrude tied Sylvia to the bed and exclaimed that if she could hold her bladder through the night, that she would once again be allowed to sleep upstairs. So as we've, said a couple of times now already, Sylvia is incontinent. So obviously she's not going to be able to hold her bladder overnight. And when Gertrude checks on her the next day, she did indeed, wet the bed. Gertrude then forced Sylvia to undress and go downstairs. And basically at this point, she forced Sylvia to do a striptease for Coy Hubbard and all these other boys. And then she forced Sylvia to masturbate in front of these boys as well. And inexplicably, out of nowhere, Gertrude then begins to bring up the supposed accusations that Sylvia had made against her daughters, Paula and Stephanie. It said that Gertrude became so enraged that she began shouting, you branded my daughters, now I'm going to brand you. Sylvia was then forcibly tied down and gagged by some of Gertrude's children. and Gertrude would begin to heat a needle with a series of matches until it was red hot. And when the needle was red hot, Gertrude began to carve the letters I and M into Sylvia's stomach. So Gertrude's hands began to shake and she was coughing, so she ultimately decided that she couldn't follow through with this so-called tattooing or branding. So she then passes the needle on to Ricky Hobbs. And Ricky Hobbs would begin to, put this brand or this tattoo on Sylvia's body, and it would actually end up reading, I am a prostitute and proud of it. And at one point, while Ricky was doing this branding or what have you, he actually stopped to ask Gertrude, how do I spell prostitute? Because he didn't even know. So then basically Gertrude just gets a piece of paper and writes it down for him so that he can copy it. Just the fucking audacity of these people just really irritates my soul. And when the process was finished, this tattoo or brand that they had left behind actually resulted in third-degree burns. And it said that modern plastic surgery would not have even been able to correct these injuries. Gertrude then became winded and actually left the room and left Sylvia alone with her daughter Paula, Ricky Hobbs, and her other 10-year-old daughter, Shirley. So mind you, I did say that Shirley, at this point in time, is only 10 years old, and she actually chimes in and decides that, hey, we should give Sylvia another tattoo. So Ricky, Paula, and Shirley decide to carve an S into Sylvia's chest. Basically, what that meant was that Sylvia essentially was their slave. So Ricky reheats this needle and he actually does like the top part of the letter S, but for whatever reason he decides that he doesn't want to finish it. So at that point he then hands it to 10-year-old Shirley and she finishes something, but what it actually ends up looking like is a number 3 because she's 10 years old and clearly illiterate and she wrote the bottom part of the S backwards. Gertrude re-enters the room and begins to taunt Sylvia, saying shit like, what are you going to do now, Sylvia? You'll never be able to get married. You'll never be able to undress in front of anyone ever again. And it said that Sylvia simply dryly replied, there's really nothing I can do now. It's on there forever. And at this point, Coy Hubbard had shown up, so he was instructed to take Sylvia back down into the basement. And during this time, he proceeded to practice his judo on Sylvia's body before he would leave the Baniszewski residence and return home. And at some point after all of this, Jenny actually manages to sneak down into the basement to sit with Sylvia and to kind of, check on her. And it's at this point that Sylvia looks up at Jenny and tells her, I'm gonna die, Jenny. I can just tell. Now I know, it's easy to sit here and say if I were in that situation, I definitely would have gone and got help. But I really feel like I really would have fucking been screaming it from the mountaintops. That type of mistreatment or that type of abuse. I would not go ever so gently into the night. I understand being a young girl and being terrified of what might happen to you, but when it comes down to a life or death situation for your own family, someone you supposedly love and care so much about, I just will never really understand why Jenny didn't try harder to get help. I am in no way placing blame on her because I'm sure the experience was horrific for herself, and not just Sylvia. But at the same time, you definitely got to take a step back and think what was going through her mind during this time and why, like I said, did she not try harder to get help for her and her sister? And shortly after Jenny visited Sylvia, for whatever reason, Gertrude decided that she was going to allow Sylvia to stay upstairs. She had awoke the following day, and Stephanie, Paula, and Gertrude proceeded to give her one of her ritualistic baths. After Sylvia was done with her bath and they had dried her off and dressed her, she was then forced to write a letter that was dictated to her by Gertrude Baniszewski. And I am actually going to read the letter in its entirety, so forgive me, I am going to be reading from a page, but The letter read, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Likens, I went with a gang of boys in the middle of the night. They said that they would pay me if I would give them something, so I got in the car and they got all they wanted. And when they got finished, they beat me up and left sores all over my face and body. They also put on my stomach, 'I am a prostitute and proud of it.' I have done just about everything that I could do to make Gertie mad and cost Gertie more money than she's got. I've tore up a new mattress and peed on it. I have also cost Gertie doctor bills that she really can't pay. And I've made Gertie a nervous wreck and all of her kids." So then Gertrude, makes her write this letter, but she, for some reason, specifically tells Sylvia not to sign her name at the bottom. And I really don't know what Gertrude was thinking at this point, because she has Sylvia address the letter to Mr. and Mrs. Likens. I don't feel like anybody would fall for that shit, you know what I'm saying? Because why would someone's child address them in that sort of manner? You just gotta stop and think, why was Gertrude forcing Sylvia to write this bizarre letter? What exactly was she planning? And as it turns out, Gertrude was actually concocting a plan to have her son John Jr. and Jenny Likens take Sylvia to a nearby dump and, kind of just leave her there to die. So somehow Sylvia overhears this and she makes one last attempt at an escape. Sylvia had, tried to make her way to the front door, but in her emaciated, mutilated state, she was actually moving so slowly that Gertrude was able to catch her right as she got to the door and drag her back into the house. So obviously Sylvia is freaking out. She's screaming, she's crying, "Let me go." And Gertrude basically at this point is trying to do anything she can to quiet down Sylvia and calm her down. She decides to try and make Sylvia some toast. Maybe if she eats something, she'll feel better, she'll calm down, and she won't think that, I'm going to kill her, basically. So Sylvia sits down and she attempts to eat this toast, but she's unable to eat because she can't swallow. So when she tells Gertrude that she's unable to swallow, Gertrude then yanks down a curtain rod from the window and begins to beat Sylvia in the mouth and face with said curtain rod. John Jr. was then instructed to take Sylvia back down to the basement and tie her up, while Gertrude made her a plate of crackers. When Gertrude offered these crackers to Sylvia, she simply told her, "Look, feed them to the dog. It's hungrier than I am." So we all know Gertrude, got pissed off by this snarky comment that Sylvia had made, but at this point in time, I don't really think Sylvia gave much of a shit, I mean, how could she? She knew she was going to die in this house. So basically, Gertrude begins to repeatedly punch Sylvia in the stomach until she falls over, and then she leaves her alone again down in the basement. On October 24th, for whatever reason, Gertrude decided that she was going to attempt to bludgeon Sylvia. Her first attempt was with some kind of wooden chair that was in the basement. So she takes a swing at Sylvia with this chair, and she actually misses and ends up breaking the chair against the wall. So her first attempt fails, and then her second attempt, she actually takes her wooden paddle and tries to swing it at Sylvia. Somehow when she does this, it actually ends up coming back and smacking her in the face, giving her a black eye. Gertrude then became enraged and instructed Coy Hubbard to begin beating Sylvia with a broken piece of a broomstick. Coy Hubbard would actually beat Sylvia so hard that she would end up unconscious. Over the course of the night and into the early morning hours of October 25th, Sylvia Likens actually beat the basement floor with an iron shovel in hopes that somebody, a neighbor, anybody, would hear her and come to help her. And in fact, several neighbors did hear this clanging sound and these calls for help, but for whatever reason, nobody decided to report this. On October 26th, Gertrude instructed Stephanie Baniszewski and Ricky Hobbs to bring Sylvia upstairs to give her her bath. So Ricky and Stephanie laid Sylvia in the tub fully clothed, but they quickly realized that something was wrong, and they pulled her out of the water. And it was at this point that they realized Sylvia was not breathing. And it's at this point in time that Stephanie attempts to perform CPR on Sylvia, but it's too late, and by this time, Sylvia has already passed away. And I think that that is a good place to stop for part 3. Initially, I was thinking that this series would only be 3 parts, but there's a lot of information out there, so we are actually going to end up having 4 parts to this story. The 4th part, we are going to talk about Sylvia's death and the trial and just the aftermath of everything that happens after, the death of Sylvia Likens. As I said before, thank you for bearing with me. I know it's been a couple of weeks since I last posted, and my voice is still a little hoarse. I've kind of had a little bit of a cold, so thank you for listening to me sound very manly and hoarse, and I hope it actually doesn't sound too bad, but I apologize if it does. I've been working on a couple of new Indie Haunts segments, and I'm actually working on a couple more other bigger stories that I will be announcing in the coming weeks. I just want to say thank you to everybody who tunes in and supports my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you like what I do here at Infamous Indie, feel free to share my content. And as always, stay spooky, keep it creepy, and watch your back out there because it's a crazy fucking world.